So I did my psychology presentation on generalized anxiety disorder. So what is it? Very basically, generalized anxiety disorder is the exaggerated tension, worrying, and nervousness about everyday life events. The key word there is going to be exaggerated because it's going to be a lot more than other individuals. It's going to be this constant worrying and anxiety that they're dealing with about daily things that most people wouldn't even think twice about. It's going to be a lot more than just the feeling of being worried. Everyone feels worried at some point or another in life or feels nervous. That's totally normal. What is different here with people who are suffering from anxiety disorder is that they're going to feel this a lot more often, and it's going to be amplified times 10 for them. The excessive and ongoing feelings of stress and anxiety are something that these people are constantly dealing with at all times, to the point that it is very difficult for them to control, and it's going to negatively affect their daily life. The big thing there is it's so difficult for them to actually get this under control that it really affects them negatively at all times in their life. I thought it was important to include the definition of anxiety here, as it's going to appear many times in this presentation. And the definition is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. So the symptoms of this, things that you can point to that might be able to tell you if you suffer from it or not. The first of which is persistent anxiety about things that are generally out of proportion to the actual impact of the events. And what that boils down to is it's the constant anxiety, but it's generally about things that really don't merit that sort of anxiety. Little things that maybe not aren't as important to other people. People who suffer from anxiety disorder are going to be extremely worried about them. Overthinking things and automatically expecting the worst case scenario. Overthinking is going to be a big issue for people who suffer from anxiety disorder. And a lot of times in most situations, they're going to automatically think it's going to be the worst case scenario when oftentimes that is just not the case. A lot of times people who have anxiety disorder are going to perceive situations as threatening when in reality they're actually quite harmless. I think a good example of this would be like public speaking. It's a situation that someone with an anxiety disorder would probably not be a big fan of, but because they're feeling that it's going to be a really serious situation when in reality it's not that big of a deal. People who suffer from anxiety disorder are not good at all with uncertainty. I think a lot of times you'll see people who suffer from anxiety disorder are going to be very big routine oriented people. And that stems from the fact that they don't like the uncertainty of everyday life, things coming their way that they didn't really expect, that they're not really big fans of that. Indecisiveness or fear of making the wrong decisions. A lot of times people who have anxiety disorder are going to defer to others in decision-making processes because they're either don't know what decision to make, or they're fearful that they will make the wrong decision in most situations. The inability to let go of worry and the inability to relax or feel at ease are two really big ones that people suffer from. The worry side of things, that they're going to feel like at all times when they're worried, they really can't let go of it, where some people who don't suffer from it might be able to let it pass in time. People who suffer from anxiety disorder are going to have a really hard time with just letting go of that. The inability to relax or feel at ease is going to come from, with this constant feeling of worrying and anxiety. A lot of times people who suffer from this are going to feel like they can't really relax because they're constantly worried about something. So I thought this was important to add here before we start to get into the effects of the disease. is the sympathetic nervous system. So when you have any type of anxiety-related disorder, one of the things that's going to happen is your sympathetic nervous system, or your SNS, is going to work overtime, or way more than it should. Your SNS very basically activates your fight or flight instincts, which are survival instincts. But the issue here is that when you have generalized anxiety disorder, your SNS is being activated more often, and probably in a lot of situations that it probably shouldn't be. The problem here is, with this being activated a lot more, it's going to lead to many other health issues that we're going to explore later, that, if you didn't suffer from anxiety disorder, you probably wouldn't have, or that wouldn't be the cause of them. So what causes it? So boiling it down, the big overarching thing here is that any sort of anxiety or mental disorder is going to come from in the brain. And the thing here is going to be chemical imbalances in the brain. I put there serotonin imbalances because that would no doubt impact an anxiety disorder, having a serotonin imbalance in your brain. But that's going to come with, any sort of mental disorder, anything that's stemming from the brain is going to have issues in brain chemistry. One way that you can develop this is through genetics. So, just with any sort of genetics, if someone in your family, your mom, your dad, your grandparents have the disorder, there is a pretty good chance it could pass down through genetics to you. Another way that you can develop it is through development and personality. And I put environment there because I think that better sums it up. Is, when you grow up in any sort of environment that may be high stress, that could lead to you developing an anxiety disorder later on in life. How does it affect daily life? So there's many different ways that it can affect your daily life. The first of which, and the all-encompassing one, if you will, is health. So when you have an anxiety disorder, your health is going to generally be negatively impacted in a lot of different ways, and these are those ways. The first way that your health is going to be generally impacted is digestive problems. So people that have generalized anxiety disorder are going to have issues with eating, whether that be an appetite problem, or, they could be overeating, under eating. It can be a lot of different things that could result in, say, an upset stomach or things of that nature. But there is going to be a lot of digestive problems that people who have anxiety disorder are going to suffer from. Neurological issues is another one. As we talked about earlier with your SNS and the chemical imbalances in your brain, your neurological systems are going to be a little off if you have anxiety disorder. This could lead to many different things, whether that be anger issues or depression, or it could be anything like that. And it just stems from the constant anxiety, nervousness, and things like that. One that's probably not as thought of would be cardiovascular conditions. So with the constant stress of anxiety disorder, stress is obviously a bad thing. We can tell that by stress can relate directly to things such as high blood pressure, which go straight into cardiovascular conditions. So actually there are many cases where people who have anxiety disorder develop cardiovascular conditions. Another less thought of situation is prone to more illnesses. So when you have anxiety disorder, a lot of times it's not uncommon to see people, because of their SNS, their fight or flight, being enacted a lot more. When your SNS is enacted, your immune system gets a temporary boost, which can throw it off in situations that it actually needs to be enacted. And it could lead to situations where people who have anxiety disorder are actually getting the illnesses more often than someone who doesn't would. And the big one here is overall quality of life. For a lot of people who suffer from anxiety disorder, unfortunately, their quality of life is not as high as maybe someone who doesn't, because they're constantly dealing with issues, stemming from worrying, nervousness, and things like that. and their quality of life, it does tend to be a little bit lower. What can it lead to? So, unfortunately, for a lot of people, anxiety disorder is not the end of the road. It can lead to some more serious issues. The first of which would be depression. And depression is, feelings of sadness to a point that is uncontrollable. The feelings of anxiety that you constantly have to deal with an anxiety disorder can unfortunately lead to a person developing forms of depression, just because they're constantly having to, deal with this weight on their back of anxiety that through every situation. That it could get pretty stressful for someone, and it could lead to depression. And with that, another thing that it can lead to, unfortunately, is addiction. So people who have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder have been shown to be more likely to turn to substances in order to help them cope. A lot of times people who suffer from anxiety are really looking for any way out, some sort of release from that. And a lot of times they turn to bad things such as drugs and alcohol. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, lead straight down a road of addiction. Treatment. So the great thing about anxiety disorder, it is a disease that can be treated. But the biggest thing you need to know is when to ask for help. So there's two main paths of treatment. The first of which is going to be straight medication. There are actually medications that can help you with anxiety and depression. I listed some of them here, but those are going to have to be prescribed by a doctor. A lot of cases, and people that I know that have taken these medications, they actually really don't like them, because in a lot of cases they're going to give you a feeling of artificial happiness, and I think a lot of people don't really like that. So the next option would be therapy. Seeking professional help can be the best course of action for some individuals. Many times having a therapist to be able to talk to can be instrumental in treating anxiety disorder, because a lot of these people feel like they're going through this stuff alone. And by seeking professional help, that can really be the best thing. Having someone to talk to through this situation can be the best situation for them. The two different types of therapy that I listed here are psychotherapy and cognitive behavior therapy. And the difference between them is psychotherapy is going to be your traditional one-on-one with a therapist, them sitting down and talking through your issues with you. And they also may be able to prescribe some anti-anxiety drugs if they think that is necessary. So I think in a lot of situations, therapy is the best first course of action for a lot of individuals. The second thing I listed there is cognitive behavior therapy. And what that is it can be in a one-on-one or group setting, and it can be like, dealing with the behavior side of things, maybe like a lifestyle change for individuals. And this can come in, situations where you may need other individuals who are also going through the same thing as you to be able to cope together. A lot of individuals really benefit from that, so that's another form of treatment that may be beneficial for someone going through anxiety disorder. Personal experience. So I really wanted to provide some sort of real-life example to tie this all together, and I thought, what better real-life example than my own? So unfortunately for me, I do have a bit of personal experience with anxiety disorder. My mother suffered from anxiety disorder most of her adult life, and this stemmed from things that happened in her childhood that, unfortunately she carried with her, and it led to her suffering from anxiety. For me, this also was passed down to me, and I don't know whether this was environmental, because watching her deal with it, living with someone who also suffered from it could have had an impact on me, or it could have been genetics because she suffered from it. She may have passed it down to me. I don't really know, but I do suffer from it as well. For her, it ended up being a worst case scenario sort of situation, because it led to many health problems and addiction, which ultimately led to her death at a very young age, relatively speaking. For her, it was the worst case scenario sort of thing, where she suffered from anxiety most of her life, and then it ultimately led to her getting addicted to alcohol, which ultimately led to other health issues, and it just all came to a head, and she died at the age of 58, which is really sad for me. But it did make me feel like I needed to seek some professional help, because I really did not want to end up in a situation like hers. I wanted to get out in front of it, get some help, and try and combat this anxiety disorder in a healthy manner, so that I wouldn't end up in a situation like her. So in conclusion, many people suffer from anxiety disorder. It's not an uncommon disease whatsoever. It doesn't make you less of a person if you're suffering from it, and it very much can be overcome. In a lot of cases, you're gonna be living with it all the time. However, if you learn to cope with it in healthy ways, you can very easily overcome it. The biggest thing is knowing when to ask for help, and then going out and seeking that help is the next biggest thing. Takes the strongest individual to admit when they have a problem, and then going out and trying to fix that problem. Whether it be through medication or therapy, the first step is knowing there's a problem and being willing to admit it. I've seen firsthand what anxiety disorder can do to someone I love, and I don't want anyone else to have to go through that. I provided some numbers here for any individuals that might be suffering through it. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, when they suffer anxiety disorder or depression, they do lead to thoughts of suicide. So I provided the link, or the phone number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. And I feel like that's important for anyone who may be watching this video from an outside of this psych class. I think that both of these numbers are very useful, and I encourage someone to use them to seek that help that they may need. Yeah, and so here's my works cited page of some of the sources that I used, and yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.